The good thing about being in discussion is that you get to listen hard to what everybody is saying. And this really was a tremendous group of folks presenting a wide range of opinions and facts and backgrounds and approaches. And I think that'll give us a lot of really good material for our question period. I wanted to highlight sort of 4 areas that we heard from a number of different panelists to start us off on that process. And I wanted to start also from the standpoint of driving up from Washington today, because, and just a side note, I'm here in my personal capacity, not as a State Department official, so please take everything in, including what I'm about to say about Congress, in that vein. We've been working a lot with the current Congress and looking at the one that is coming in. And the new House starts to move in about a week. There's been a lot of preparation on that. And I think what that has done in Washington is really to batten down the hatches in the sense that we're in a moment of incredible fiscal austerity. A lot of concern about what the American public wants to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, in a sense that our ability to maneuver is probably getting much more narrow. But within that, we're in the moment where we actually need a much more broadened and robust strategic discussion about what we should be doing, and yet at the same time the incentives, as we're saying, are probably against that. So a lot of what I'm going to say in highlighting what the panelists have discussed is really a plea for all of us, both with our Congress here in the United States and with this administration, but also with those of you who are in who come from European parliaments that are grappling with very similar issues, that we educate, and I'll come back to that again. I think I wanted to start with some of the things that you said, Christine, because it very much resonated that the discussion in Washington and in many areas, and I came from a Council on Foreign Relations discussion this morning where it was the same thing, which is it's a very black and white discussion about 2011 and a troop withdrawal. And a troop withdrawal is not a strategy, it is a benchmark. But it is being treated as a strategy in a lot of the dialogues that are going on in think tanks and elsewhere. And I think what's interesting is that we're focusing very much on what our troops do or do not do, and even whether we should be switching up U.S. or international troops at this point in time. We spend a lot of time focusing on that and the military dynamics, as you were saying, and then we sort of say, well, and then we need governance, and then we need development. And I'll tell you, having spent a lot of time at ISAF headquarters during a very intensive planning process, that is actually the way the military has looked at a lot of this over time, and it's gotten a lot better. But ISAF itself at headquarters has 3 or 4 different lines of very, very detailed security actions, and then governance and development. And I'm hopeful, as you were saying, Ambassador Tanin, that the strategy that President Karzai is looking to address at the NATO discussions will start to look at what the Afghan government is saying needs to be done on the governance side. But I would point you to something that Sarah Chase, who's the former NPR reporter who's worked a lot in Afghanistan, said, is that we focused on a clear hold, build, transfer strategy for the military. But if you really are trying to build governance in a country that has struggled for so long in a situation of civil war, you need to look at a clear hold, build situation for governance as well. And when she said that, she says we focused a lot on the hold, and we focused a lot on the build. But we didn't focus as much on the clear. And you can't really hold and build in coin strategy if you haven't cleared. And so I think the question that she posed to the government of Afghanistan, and that we have often tried to move around, was how do you operate in a situation where you have actors, power brokers, and folks who are actively working against the state as the government of Afghanistan is trying to build it. So I think that the question then is, what is that detailed strategy for governance and building it going forward that really does lay out, acknowledging the powers that be and how they operate in Afghanistan, lay out what needs to be done, and not in florid terms of what we call in the planning world motherhood and apple pie, but really actually a step-by-step, how do we get to governance that is legitimate. I would point you also to this issue, Dawood, you talked about oversight and the fact that part of the reason why we don't have stronger strategies in those areas is because no one's asking for them. And when you look at what Congress has been asking for, they're very concerned about provincial reconstruction teams and how they operate. They're very concerned about bribes around contracts. They haven't been as concerned about what the strategy is, not outside of the military strategy and what the troops are doing, but what the civilian-led part of that strategy is. And when we were operating in a civ-mil strategic environment trying to build that plan, it was very clear that we didn't have a lot of the building blocks of what the civilian strategy really needs to be and how it's going to work with the government of Afghanistan, own internal discussions about how to move forward. So the first thing I would push you all as citizens is to look and to push our Congress and those parliaments for a real strategic conversation. And we need that both within those bodies, but also in the press and in the larger conversation. And I would say, given the conversation at the Council this morning, that was not happening. The second point I wanted to touch on was Johannes's point on the underlying politics and the fact that we have a number of people deploying every year. You know, the U.S. side talks a lot about 9 one-year wars. Instead of 1 9-year war, 9 one-year wars. And the reason for that is because there is a transition every year of new troops coming in. I would say it exists on the development and the relief side as well. And as a result, you have a re-education every single year as to what we are doing and how we are doing it, and you remake the relationships every year. The problem with that, and this was a question earlier at the earlier session, is that we don't do a very good job of transitioning knowledge about how power relationships work in Afghanistan. And we don't necessarily do a very good job of talking about how the patronage systems work that you were talking about, Dawood, in terms of where money is moving and where power is moving. And there's an example that there was a program that they called AP3, which was the Afghanistan Public something. Anyway, we like acronyms. The point is this was a locally developed program in Wardak province, and the idea of it was that we would have locally formed guardians. It was a sort of local community stabilization program that would work with the police. What was interesting about that is that the military was very focused on whether these were different ethnic groups, because we knew enough that we needed to have a mixture of that, and that was certainly a concern of the governor of Wardak. What was interesting, though, is an NGO did a study of that program and found out that local political parties had divided out the positions of guardians between themselves before the program had even started. That there was this underlying process going on that the folks who were administrating the project knew nothing about. And again, that supports, I think, your point of underlying politics. The issue, though, is that even if, as you said, Johannes, that the international community is never really going to understand it, the problem is they are still the folks who are running a lot of these programs, and they need to understand it better. And I would say that reconciliation, particularly as a program, will not work with international assistance if there isn't a better understanding of those underlying politics. And so what I put out to the Afghans in this discussion, and to those of you who follow this topic, is how do we do a better job at communicating what those politics are and how they work and how power operates in Afghanistan. Last 2 points. I think, Chris, you talked about the issue of key districts and the ways in which we focused on different parts of the country. And I would put out there that I think in all of our discussions, we look at Afghanistan as one entity, and forget that this is a country that has incredible regional diversity and power dynamics that range across the country in many very different ways. Having been through a planning process where we really tried very hard to have different regional components of that plan for the first time, and it was a struggle to get the American system and the ISAF system to think regionally about what the objectives were in Afghanistan and the different dynamics around the country. I would put out to you that as we look at at the ways in which we cut the problem set and think about it, that we look very specifically at the very different issues of regions in Afghanistan and where they are in the whole process. because certainly the Taliban and other insurgent groups do understand that very well. I would also put out that on the key district issue particularly, we've had tremendous attention deficit disorder as we look at the different transitions from year to year between military administrations and also, I think, civilian side as well on the international front. I wanted to engage just one last point on your point, Chris, on nation building and why is the military doing this. There's actually an interesting study at NDU, National Defense University, about how the military in almost every war the U.S. has been involved in has been engaged in these activities. What happened is that they forgot how to do it as well as they used to. Well, that's the myth, right? But I think it's an interesting point because what it means is that we have turned to the military in every single war to do this job. And I know, Ambassador Finn, you were mentioning earlier the need for the civilian side of this to do a better, to step up to it. I would put out there, as part of that effort, that we haven't plotted a very good course for what that needs to look like, less from the supply side, but from the demand side. What does it look like in Afghanistan to have international civilians who really are able to assist in an effective way? And what I would say there is that we tend to define the civilian side of the strategy as anti-military. So if the military leaves, we're left with civilians, that's the civilian strategy. And you would say, for anyone who's a strategic planner, that is not a strategy, that is the absence of a strategy. And I think the question there is, what is that vision? If we do, in fact, start talking about a drawdown, it goes beyond the transition of province by province ANSF security forces, and you really need a much more comprehensive picture of what transition looks like and what your civilians, both international and Afghan, are doing to help make that happen. And I think if we don't have that, we will start transitioning anyway, and we'll end up with this question of why weren't the civilians there and why weren't they doing their job. But if we don't do the work of defining what that job is and making sure they have the resources and the ability to get there, then it will inevitably fail. And I think that's where it comes back to your point, Daoud, which is on coherence. That as we talk about democracy building, state building, security building, all of these different pieces, they often run in contradiction to each other or can undermine each other at the same time. And what that says to me is that as we enter into this period where all focus is on the military transition, that we need a very much more robust conversation perhaps based on what President Karzai will present to NATO on what a civilian answer to this is and what both an Afghan and an international side. It goes beyond the Afghan National Development Strategy, which was developed as a long-term vision, but didn't address the security reality of the changing times. And I know they've been trying to prioritize and fix that over time, but I think the question is, how do we have a strategy going forward that says what we do without such a large military force, but that recognizes the true security risks and issues that we are in right now? So I would lay that out to you to start the question period.
Wonderful.
And
Thank you.